The forest had died long before the war reached it. Captain Elias Thorne knew this the moment his boots touched the ashen ground. The trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their bark blackened and split, branches clawing at a moonless sky choked with smoke. No birds sang here. No insects hummed. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir the air, as if afraid to disturb whatever malevolence had claimed this place as its own. Behind him, the sounds of battle had faded to a distant roar, steel on steel, the screams of the dying, the wet thunder of siege engines hurling fire into stone. The war between humanity and the nocturnal kingdoms had raged for 3 blood-soaked years, and Elias had seen enough death to fill 1,000 graveyards. He'd earned his captaincy not through noble birth, but through sheer survival, through learning which orders to follow and which to quietly ignore when survival demanded it. Tonight, survival had demanded he retreat. His battalion had been ambushed at the Raven Cross Bridge, torn apart by a coordinated vampire strike force that had come screaming out of the shadows with inhuman speed. Elias had watched men he'd known for years reduced to exsanguinated husks in seconds, their armor no more protective than parchment against claws that could rend steel. He'd given the order to scatter, to regroup at the fallback point 5 miles south, and then he'd run like a coward into these God's-forsaken woods. Except he wasn't a coward. He was a pragmatist. Dead heroes decorated no battlefields, only their corpses did. The runes etched into his breastplate flickered weakly, their protective enchantments nearly exhausted. The light they cast was sickly and green, barely enough to see 3 paces ahead. Elias pressed on, one hand on the hilt of his longsword, the other clutching the gash in his side, where a vampire's claws had found the gap between his pauldron and cuirass. The wound wasn't deep, but it bled steadily, leaving a trail any predator could follow. He needed to find shelter, bind the wound, catch his breath. Instead, he found her. The clearing appeared without warning, as if the forest had suddenly decided to exhale and create a pocket of open space. Ancient pillars rose from the ground like broken teeth, remnants of some long-forgotten temple or monument. They were carved with symbols Elias didn't recognize, spiraling patterns and angular glyphs that seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision, settling into stillness when he looked at them directly. And in the center of it all, collapsed against the largest pillar, was a figure that made every instinct Elias possessed scream at him to run. A vampire. But not just any vampire. Even from 20 paces away, even in the dim light of his dying runes, Elias could see the regality in her bearing. She wore armor of black steel trimmed with crimson, fitted to her slender frame with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of royal armories and master smiths. Her cape, though torn and bloodied, had once been magnificent, deep red silk lined with cloth of silver, now hanging in tatters from her shoulders. Her hair was the color of moonlight itself, long and straight, spilling across her shoulders and pooling on the ground around her. She was dying. Elias recognized death when he saw it. He'd seen it in enough faces, both human and otherwise. The vampire's skin, naturally pale, had taken on a translucent quality, like frosted glass. Her armor was cracked in a dozen places, and through those cracks seeped something that wasn't quite blood. Darker, thicker, with an iridescent sheen that caught the light strangely. Mist rose from the wounds, curling upward like departing spirits. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and irregular. One hand was pressed to a massive wound in her side, fingers slick and trembling. The other lay limp at her side, clawed fingers still extended, as if she'd been fighting until the very moment consciousness left her. Elias should have drawn his sword, should have approached carefully, confirmed the kill, and moved on. This was the enemy. This was one of the creatures that had slaughtered his men, that had been terrorizing humanity's borders for years, and that fed on human blood like livestock. Instead, he found himself taking a step forward. Then another. His rational mind threw up protests with every footfall. "She's a vampire. She'll kill you. This is a trap. Walk away." But something deeper overrode those objections. Something he'd thought the war had burned out of him years ago. Compassion. She looked so young. Not in the way vampires often appeared young, despite centuries of existence, but genuinely young. 17, maybe 18 if she'd been human. There was something heartbreaking about seeing someone so young lying broken and alone in a dead forest, even if that someone had fangs and claws. Elias knelt beside her, keeping his sword hand free out of habit, and studied her more closely. Up close, the quality of her armor was even more apparent. This wasn't the mass-produced gear of a foot soldier. The blackened steel had been engraved with intricate patterns, each piece fitted together with such precision that the seams were nearly invisible. The crimson trim wasn't paint, but some kind of crystalline inlay that seemed to glow faintly from within. Nobility, perhaps even royalty, which made his next decision even more insane.
Elias had seen enough battlefield wounds to know when someone was bleeding out. The vampire princess, he decided that's what she must be, had minutes at most. Whatever had done this to her had done it thoroughly. The wound in her side was massive, and similar injuries marked her shoulder, thigh, and throat. Something had torn into her with savage efficiency, something strong enough to pierce vampire-enhanced armor. Another vampire, perhaps. The nocturnal kingdoms were constantly at war with each other, their alliances as shifting and treacherous as morning fog. Or maybe she'd been caught by a human strike team equipped with blessed weapons and alchemical fire. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. She was dying. And Elias, against every shred of logic and self-preservation he possessed, was about to save her. He fumbled at his belt for his field kit, pulling out a small glass vial no larger than his thumb. Inside sloshed a clear liquid, holy water, blessed by the priests of the Dawn Cathedral, one of humanity's most effective weapons against the undead. A few drops on a vampire's skin would cause burns. More than that could be fatal. Elias set it aside and drew his knife. His hands were steadier than they had any right to be as he pulled back the bloodied cloth he'd stuffed into his own wound and cut a deeper incision. Fresh pain flared, but he bit down on it, focusing on the task at hand. Blood welled up immediately, running down his side in thick rivulets. He worked the knife into his palm next, creating a shallow cut across the meat of his thumb. Blood pooled in his cupped hand. He let it collect for a moment, then reached for an empty vial from his kit, this one meant for collecting samples of alchemical compounds or poisoned water. The vial filled slowly. Elias had to make a second cut across his forearm to get enough blood, his vision swimming slightly from blood loss. When he was done, the vial contained perhaps 2 ounces of dark red blood already cooling in the night air. He held it up, watching the moonlight, when had the moon emerged, filter through the liquid. It seemed to glow faintly, though that might have been his imagination, or the runes on his armor, or the delirium of blood loss. "This is the stupidest thing you've ever done," he muttered to himself. Then he uncorked the vial and pressed it to the vampire princess's lips. At first, nothing happened. Elias tilted the vial, letting the blood trickle past her pale lips, and waited. Her chest continued its shallow rise and fall. The mist continued to rise from her wounds. She didn't swallow, didn't move, gave no indication that she was even aware of his presence. He was too late. She was already gone. Her body just hadn't realized it yet. Then her eyes opened. They were the color of blood mixed with wine, deep crimson with flecks of darker burgundy, pupils mere slits in the center. They fixed on him with an intensity that made Elias's breath catch, pinning him in place as surely as a spear through the chest. There was awareness in those eyes, yes, but also something primal and hungry and utterly inhuman. Her hand shot up faster than thought, closing around his wrist with crushing strength. The vial fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers, bouncing off her armor and rolling away into the darkness. Her other hand, the one that had been pressed to her wound, grabbed his collar and pulled him down with irresistible force. Elias had time to think, "I'm dead," before her fangs sank into his throat. The pain was extraordinary. It wasn't like being cut or stabbed. Those were sharp, clean pains that the mind could process and categorize. This was something else entirely, a violation on a level his body wasn't equipped to handle. Her fangs weren't just piercing his skin. They were burrowing into the vein, latching on with a lamprey's tenacity and pulling. He felt his blood leaving him in rhythmic pulses, felt it being drawn up and out with each beat of his frantic heart. The world tilted sideways, his vision grayed at the edges. His hands scrabbled uselessly at her shoulders, trying to push her away, but she held him effortlessly, her supernatural strength returning with every swallow. "She's killing me," he thought distantly. "I saved her, and she's killing me." But then something changed. The pulling sensation intensified, but the pain began to recede, replaced by a strange warmth that spread out from the puncture wounds. It was almost pleasant in a terrifying way, like sinking into a hot bath after a freezing day, or the first rush of strong wine on an empty stomach. His struggles weakened, then stopped altogether. His hands, which had been pushing against her, now rested on her shoulders almost gently. His heartbeat slowed. The world became soft around the edges. Darkness crept in from all sides. "This is how it ends," he thought. "Not on a battlefield, not with a sword in my hand, but in a dead forest, drained by the creature I tried to save." There was a certain poetry to it, he supposed. His eyes drifted closed.
Consciousness returned like a reluctant tide, bringing with it a constellation of uncomfortable sensations. Cold ground beneath him, the sharp bite of frost in the air, a pounding headache that seemed determined to crack his skull from the inside, and a weight on his chest, something substantial and warm that hadn't been there before. Elias's eyes flickered open. The moon hung directly overhead now, full and bright, no longer obscured by smoke or clouds. It painted the clearing in shades of silver and shadow, turning the ancient pillars into stark monoliths that seemed to lean in with curiosity. Embers drifted through the air like terrestrial stars, though Elias couldn't identify their source. There was no fire nearby, no sign of what might be burning. And draped across his chest, face pressed into the crook of his neck with possessive intimacy, was the vampire princess. She was still pale, but no longer translucent. The mist had stopped rising from her wounds, and though the injuries hadn't fully closed, they'd contracted significantly, their edges knitting together with visible progress. Her breathing was deeper now, regular, almost peaceful. Her silver hair spilled across his armor like liquid moonlight, and one of her hands was fisted in the leather straps of his cuirass, holding him close with unmistakable intent. She'd curled around him like a cat claiming its territory. Elias's first instinct was to shove her off and scramble away. His second was to check how much blood he'd lost, assess his condition, determine if he could even stand. His third, and the one that actually manifested, was to remain perfectly still and try to understand what exactly had just happened. He was alive. That was the first miracle. Vampires didn't stop feeding until their victim was dead or they were forcibly pulled away. Yet here he was, weak and dizzy but undeniably breathing. His heart was beating, his lungs were working, and while he felt like he'd been bled by a particularly enthusiastic battlefield surgeon, he wasn't a desiccated corpse. She'd stopped. Why? The vampire princess stirred against him, making a sound that was almost a purr. Her lips moved against his neck, against the wounds she'd made, and Elias felt a strange tingling sensation as her tongue traced the puncture marks. It wasn't painful. In fact, it was almost soothing, like a cooling salve being applied to burned skin. Her eyes opened slowly, those crimson orbs regarding him from mere inches away. In the moonlight, he could see details he'd missed before. The faint luminescence in her irises, the delicate network of darker veins beneath her porcelain skin, the way her pupils expanded and contracted like a cat's as they focused on his face. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without breaking eye contact, she deliberately tightened her grip on his kaross and shifted closer, pressing herself more firmly against him. The message was clear. Mine. Elias swallowed. His throat was dry and the motion made his head swim. You stopped, he managed, his voice coming out as a hoarse rasp. Why? She tilted her head, the gesture oddly bird-like. When she spoke, her voice was like crystal bells wrapped in midnight, beautiful and cold and utterly inhuman. You gave, she said simply, as if that explained everything.
Vampires didn't speak often to their prey, or so Elias had been taught. They were predators, viewing humans as livestock at best and irritating insects at worst. The few vampires he'd encountered in close quarters during the war had either attacked silently or screamed insults in their own guttural language before trying to tear his throat out. This one spoke the common tongue with perfect clarity, though her accent was strange, archaic, with rolled vowels and sharp consonants that suggested she'd learned the language decades or centuries ago and never bothered updating her pronunciation. I gave? Elias repeated. His mind felt sluggish, thoughts moving through molasses. Blood loss, probably. I gave you blood. Yes. No. The vampire princess pushed herself up slightly, propping herself on one elbow so she could look down at him properly. Her hair fell around them like a silver curtain, creating a private space that held just the two of them. Not just blood. You gave, freely, with intention, with, she paused, searching for the word, compassion. Her crimson eyes narrowed, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away. He didn't. Something told him that showing weakness now would be catastrophic. Why? She demanded, and now there was genuine confusion in her voice. Why would you give your blood to save an enemy? Why would you kneel beside one of the nocturnal court and offer mercy? You wear the armor of humanity's armies. You carry blessed weapons meant to destroy my kind. You should have cut off my head while I was helpless. Instead, you... She reached up with her free hand, fingertips brushing the side of his neck where she'd fed. The touch sent a shiver down Elias's spine that had nothing to do with cold. You offered yourself, she finished softly. No human has ever done such a thing, not in all my years. How many years? Elias asked, partly out of genuine curiosity, and partly to buy himself time to think. His strategic mind, the part of him that had kept him alive through countless battles, was slowly grinding back to life. He needed to understand the situation, assess the variables, determine his next move. The vampire princess smiled for the first time, revealing fangs that gleamed like polished ivory. It was not a comforting expression. I have seen 143 winters. I was born in the reign of the Blood Moon Empress, third daughter of the Eternal Night Court, and I have commanded armies since before your grandfather's grandfather drew breath. I am Princess Seraphina Nocturne, heir to the Obsidian Throne, commander of the Shadow Legion, and keeper of the Crimson Covenant. She leaned down until her lips were nearly touching his, her eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to set the air itself alight. "You saved my life," Princess Seraphina whispered, "and now, by every law of my people, you belong to me, forever."
The word forever hung in the air like a suspended blade. Elias's mind raced, trying to process what she'd just told him. Bound? Ancient pacts? The rational part of his brain insisted this was nonsense, fever dreams brought on by blood loss and trauma. But the part of him that had been raised on stories of the old ways, that had heard the whispered legends around military campfires, recognized the truth in her words. Blood magic was real. The oldest magic, some said, the kind that predated written spells and carefully inscribed runes. The magic of intent and sacrifice, of gifts freely given and bonds forged in the space between heartbeats. It was the magic that powered the greatest healing miracles and the darkest curses, because it came from life itself. And Elias had just performed a blood magic ritual without even realizing it. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You were dying. I couldn't just walk away." Seraphina's expression softened fractionally, the predatory intensity fading enough to reveal something almost like wonder beneath. "No," she agreed, "you couldn't. Because you are not like other humans. There is something in you, soldier, something rare and precious that your kind has mostly bred out of themselves and their rush to build walls and forge weapons. You still possess mercy, true mercy, not the performative kind offered in exchange for political capital. You looked at an enemy and saw a person, looked at a monster and offered compassion." She sat up fully now, releasing him from her grip, though she remained straddled across his waist. In the moonlight, with her wounds mostly healed and her armor catching the silver glow, she looked every inch the princess she claimed to be, regal, dangerous, beautiful in the way a drawn blade is beautiful, elegant and deadly in equal measure. "I should be dead," she continued, gazing down at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I was ambushed by assassins from the court of endless winter, 3 of their best hunters equipped with weapons specifically designed to kill my bloodline. They poisoned me with essence of belladonna refined through moonless water, filled my veins with silver dust ground from blessed relics, and tore open my flesh with cursed blades that prevented healing." She looked back at him, and for just a moment Elias saw not a vampire princess, but simply a young woman who'd come terrifyingly close to death. "Your blood burned it all away," Seraphina said softly. "Human blood is corrosive to my kind, yes, but yours was pure, unpolluted by hatred or malice, given freely with genuine intent to heal. It didn't just restore my strength, it cleansed the poisons, neutralized the silver, closed wounds that should have kept me bleeding until the sun rose and finished what the assassins started." She reached out and placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady beat beneath his battered armor. "You didn't just save my life, soldier. You performed a miracle. And miracles have consequences."
The bond, Seraphina explained as she helped him sit up, was both simpler and more complicated than Elias could have imagined. On the simple side, she could sense him now. His location, his emotional state, the general condition of his health, all of it was available to her like an extra sense she'd never possessed before. The bond worked both ways, she claimed, though it would take time and practice for him to learn to use his end of it. Right now, he was like someone who'd suddenly gained the ability to see color, but didn't yet have words for what they were experiencing. On the complicated side, the bond couldn't be broken. Not by distance, not by time, not by death itself. It was woven into the fundamental essence of who they both were, a connection that transcended the physical and ventured into the realm of the spiritual. Trying to break it would be like trying to unbirth yourself, theoretically conceivable, practically impossible, and likely to end in disaster for everyone involved. "So, I'm what?" Elias asked, leaning heavily against one of the ancient pillars. His body felt like it had been hollowed out and stuffed with cotton. "Your servant? Your pet?" "My consort," Serafina corrected, and there was a note of something almost defensive in her voice. "The bond you've created is one of equals, not master and slave. You gave freely, which means the magic recognizes you as someone of sufficient will and power to stand beside me, not beneath me. You are—" She paused, searching for the right words. "You are my companion, my partner, my—" She stopped abruptly, a faint flush coloring her pale cheeks. It was a startlingly human expression on her inhuman face. "The word in my language doesn't translate well. The closest equivalent would be battle spouse or blood bonded, someone who shares my strength and my burdens, someone who I am honor-bound to protect as fiercely as they have protected me." Elias absorbed this, trying to reconcile it with everything he knew about vampire culture, which, admittedly, wasn't much beyond they drink blood, avoid sunlight, and want to kill us all. Military briefings focused on tactics and weaknesses, not cultural nuances and ancient bonding rituals. "And if I refuse?" he asked quietly. "If I just walk away?" Serafina's expression went carefully blank, but Elias felt something through the bond. A flash of emotion so intense it made his chest ache. Fear. Not fear of him, but fear for him. "The bond would pull you back," she said. "Not immediately, perhaps. Not obviously. But you would find reasons to seek me out. Dreams of me would plague your sleep. Your thoughts would drift to me at odd moments. The distance between us would become a physical ache that grew worse with every passing day until it was unbearable." She met his eyes, and her expression was grave. "I have no more choice in this than you do, soldier. Your act of compassion bound us both. If you walked away now and never returned, we would both slowly go mad from the separation. I have heard of such cases in the old stories. They do not end well." Elias closed his eyes, letting his head rest back against the cold stone. This couldn't be happening. He was a soldier, not a— what had she called it? Blood-bonded consort. He had responsibilities, a battalion to return to, assuming any of them had survived, orders to follow, a war to fight. A war against vampires, against people like Serafina. "This is insane," he muttered. "Yes," Serafina agreed. She moved to sit beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. "But sanity is overrated in times of war. I learned that lesson long ago." They sat in silence for a while, two beings from opposite sides of an ancient conflict bound together by a moment of compassion in a dead forest. Around them, the embers continued their lazy drift through the air, and the moon watched with its ancient, indifferent gaze. Finally, Elias spoke. My name is Elias Thorne, Captain, 2nd Sons Battalion, Northern Border Forces. I'm 26 years old, and I've been fighting this war for 3 years. And until about an hour ago, I would have sworn on my life that vampires were irredeemable monsters. He turned to look at her, studying her profile in the moonlight.
I think you just made my life extremely complicated, Princess. Seraphina's lips quirked into something that might have been a smile. I think, she replied, that we made each other's lives complicated. And you may call me Seraphina. If we are to be bound for eternity, formality seems excessive. Eternity, Elias repeated, testing the weight of the word. That's a long time. For you, perhaps. For me, she shrugged one elegant shoulder. I have already lived through more history than you can imagine. What's another few decades in the company of someone interesting?
I'm interesting? You gave your blood to save an enemy, Seraphina pointed out. You're either interesting or suicidally insane. I'm choosing to believe it's the former. Despite everything, the blood loss, the existential crisis, the complete upheaval of everything he thought he understood about the world, Elias found himself laughing. It was a short, bitter sound, but genuine nonetheless. Suicidally insane, he said. Definitely that one. Seraphina turned to face him fully, and the look in her eyes was something Elias couldn't quite interpret. Gratitude, perhaps, or curiosity, or something deeper and more complicated that he wasn't ready to name. Come, she said, rising to her feet with fluid grace that suggested her injuries were now entirely superficial. We cannot remain here. The assassins who attacked me may return with reinforcements, and you are in no condition to fight. I know a safe place, a sanctuary bound by ancient treaties that both our peoples honor. We can rest there, recover our strength, and decide what comes next. She extended her hand to him, pale fingers stretched out in invitation. Elias looked at that hand for a long moment, knowing that taking it would be crossing a threshold he couldn't uncross. His old life, already shattered by the night's events, would be officially over. Whatever came next would be uncharted territory. But then, hadn't he already crossed that threshold the moment he'd knelt beside a dying vampire and offered his blood? He reached up and took her hand. Her grip was cool and strong as she pulled him to his feet, steadying him when his legs wobbled treacherously. "Lead the way," Elias said. "My consort." The word felt strange in his mouth, weighted with implications he was only beginning to understand. But Seraphina's answering smile, small and surprised and genuinely pleased, made something warm unfold in his chest. The bond, perhaps. Or maybe just the simple human pleasure of making someone smile. Either way, as they left the clearing and ventured deeper into the dead forest, Elias found himself thinking that perhaps suicidal insanity wasn't the worst foundation for a relationship. At least, it would never be boring. The sanctuary Seraphina led him to was 3 miles deep into the forest, in a direction that seemed to exist at right angles to normal geography. Elias couldn't explain it better than that. They walked through the dead trees, following no path he could discern, and the world seemed to shift around them in subtle ways. The moon changed positions too quickly. The shadows fell at impossible angles. Twice he was certain they passed the same broken pillar, yet Seraphina never hesitated, never showed any sign they were lost. "We're walking the shadow roads," she explained when he finally asked. "Paths that exist between the world you know and the deeper places. My people built them millennia ago, long before your kind learned to work metal. Only those of noble blood can navigate them safely." "And me?" Elias asked, struggling to keep pace. His strength was returning slowly, but he still felt like he'd been wrung out and hung up to dry. "You're bound to someone of noble blood now," Seraphina said, glancing back at him with amusement. "The roads will accept you as an extension of me, though I wouldn't recommend trying to walk them alone. Not yet." "Not yet," Elias repeated, "as opposed to later, when I'll be an expert in impossible vampire roads." "Exactly." She seemed to miss or ignore his sarcasm entirely. "The bond will grant you access to many things that were previously closed to your kind. Abilities, perceptions, a significantly extended lifespan." That last part made Elias stumble. "What?" Seraphina stopped, turning to face him fully. In the strange light of the shadow roads, her features seemed even more inhuman. Too perfect, too symmetrical, like a statue carved by someone who understood beauty in theory, but had never quite seen it in practice. "The bond goes both ways," she said patiently. "You gave me your blood, your life essence. In drinking it, in accepting that gift, I shared my nature with you. You won't become a vampire. The transformation ritual is far more complex than a simple feeding. But you will gain some of our strengths. Increased healing, enhanced senses, and yes, a dramatically slowed aging process." That last part made Elias stumble. "What?" Seraphina stopped, turning to face him fully. In the strange light of the shadow roads, her features seemed even more inhuman, too perfect, too symmetrical, like a statue carved by someone who understood beauty in theory, but had never quite seen it in practice. "The bond goes both ways," she said patiently. "You gave me your blood, your life essence. In drinking it, in accepting that gift, I shared my nature with you. You won't become a vampire. The transformation ritual is far more complex than a simple feeding. But you will gain some of our strengths, increased healing, enhanced senses, and yes, a dramatically slowed aging process." She stepped closer, placing her hand over his heart again. It seemed to be becoming a habit. "You may live for centuries now, Elias Thorne, long enough to regret saving me, perhaps, long enough to see your world change in ways you cannot imagine, long enough to truly understand what eternity means." Elias stood frozen, processing this information. Centuries. He'd always assumed he'd die young. Most soldiers did, especially in a war like this. He'd made peace with that, had written mental goodbye letters to family members he'd never see again, had come to terms with leaving nothing but a name in a military record. Now, apparently, he had centuries. "I think," he said slowly, "that I need to sit down." "We're almost there," Seraphina assured him. "Hold on just a bit longer." She took his hand, when had that become natural, and tugged him forward. The shadow road bent around them, reality rippling like water, and then they were stepping out into somewhere entirely different.
The sanctuary was a ruin. Or, rather, it had been a ruin once, long ago, and was now in the process of being reclaimed by something that wasn't quite nature and wasn't quite magic. Stone walls rose 30 feet high, covered in luminescent moss that provided a soft blue-green glow. The ceiling was open to the sky, but the sky visible through that opening wasn't the one they'd left behind. This sky was purple, scattered with stars that were too large and too bright, arranged in constellations Elias didn't recognize. Inside the walls, a garden grew. Not a wild tangle of plants, but a carefully cultivated space, though who was doing the cultivating wasn't immediately clear. Trees with silver bark and leaves like crystal grew in neat rows. Flowers that seemed to be made of frozen light clustered in beds of luminous soil.
A small stream ran through the center of it all, its water clear as glass and faintly glowing. "Welcome," Seraphina said, "to the sanctuary of eternal twilight, one of the last neutral grounds, recognized by all the courts and kingdoms. No violence is permitted here, no magic of harm can function within these walls. It was created after the War of Broken Moons, as a place where emissaries could meet and negotiate without fear of betrayal." She led him to the edge of the stream, where smooth stones formed a natural sitting area. Elias collapsed onto one gratefully, his legs finally giving out. The stone was warm despite the cool air, and the moment he sat, he felt a subtle pulse of energy flow into him. Not healing, exactly, but a kind of stabilization. His dizziness receded. The ache in his wounds became manageable. "The sanctuary itself provides aid to those who enter," Seraphina explained, kneeling beside the stream to cup water in her hands. "Drink. It will help restore what you've lost." Elias obeyed, too tired to question. The water was cool and tasted faintly of starlight, which made no sense, but was the only description his brain could produce. As he swallowed, he felt strength flowing back into his limbs, warmth returning to his extremities. Seraphina watched him drink with an expression that might have been satisfaction. When he'd had his fill, she settled onto a stone across from him, arranging herself with unconscious grace. "We should rest here for a day," she said. "Give your body time to adjust to the changes the bond is making. By tomorrow night, you'll be strong enough to travel properly, and we can discuss what comes next." "What does come next?" Elias asked, wiping water from his mouth. "I can't exactly return to my battalion like this. Sorry I'm late, I got lost and accidentally blood-bonded with a vampire princess. Probably won't go over well at the debriefing." Seraphina's lips twitched. "No, I imagine not. Nor can I return to my court without explaining where I've been and how I survived. Showing up with a human consort would complicate matters. Your people would disapprove?" "Some would try to kill you on principle," Seraphina said bluntly. "Others would see you as a useful political tool and try to manipulate our bond for their own ends. Still others would view our connection as an abomination and demand I break it, consequences be damned." She sighed, a very human gesture. "The nocturnal courts are not unified, Elias. We are as fractured and factional as your own kingdoms, perhaps more so. Some of us want to coexist with humanity. Others want to subjugate you. Still others want to wipe you out entirely and claim the surface world for ourselves." "And you?" Elias asked. "What do you want?" Seraphina was quiet for a long moment, gazing into the glowing stream. "I want," she finally said, "what I have always wanted. Peace. Not the peace of total victory, where one side lies dead and the other stands triumphant, but genuine peace, coexistence, a world where vampires and humans can live side by side without constantly trying to destroy each other." She looked up at him, and her crimson eyes were earnest in a way that made Elias's breath catch. "I have been fighting for that dream for 70 years, Elias. I have argued before the courts, led diplomatic missions, even commanded armies when necessary, always with the goal of finding a path to peace. And I have failed, again and again, because neither side truly wants to stop fighting. Humans see us as monsters. Vampires see you as prey. The cycle continues, fed by fear and hatred on both sides." She stood, pacing to the edge of the stream, her reflection rippling in the glowing water. "And then you came along," she said softly. "A human soldier who saw an enemy dying and chose compassion over vengeance, who gave his blood freely to save a life, not because he expected reward or political gain, but because it was the right thing to do. You, Elias Thorne, are proof that my dream isn't impossible, that humans and vampires can see each other as people rather than monsters." She turned to face him, and the intensity in her gaze made him feel like she was looking straight through him, seeing all the way to his soul. "Our bond may have been an accident," Serafina said, "but I choose to see it as an opportunity, a chance to show both our peoples that cooperation is possible, that we are stronger together than apart, that perhaps, just perhaps, this endless war can finally end." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure. Elias understood what she was proposing, not just a personal relationship, but a political statement, living proof that the divide between their species wasn't insurmountable. It was idealistic, naive even, the kind of thinking that got people killed in the real world. It was, he realized, exactly what he wanted to believe. "That's a nice dream," he said quietly. "But dreams don't stop swords. They don't prevent ambushes or end wars. We're just two people, Serafina. What possible difference can we make?" She smiled then, a real smile, fierce and full of determination. "We start small. We survive. We help each other. We show anyone willing to look that cooperation benefits both parties. And then, when we're strong enough, we make our case to those in power. We become the proof that peace is possible." She extended her hand to him again, just as she had in the clearing. "It won't be easy," Serafina admitted. "We'll be opposed from all sides, hunted by extremists who view our bond as heresy, used by politicians who see us as tools. We may very well die trying to change a world that doesn't want to change." Her smile widened, showing fangs. "But we'll die trying to build something better. And that, I think, is more than most can say. So what do you say, Elias Thorne? Will you fight beside me? Not in the war that's already being waged, but in the war to end the war." Elias looked at her hand, then at her face, then up at the strange stars wheeling overhead in an impossible sky. He thought about his old life, the battalion, the endless fighting, the slow grind toward death on a battlefield he barely understood. He thought about the world he knew, where vampires and humans killed each other with mechanical regularity, and nobody questioned whether there might be another way. Then he thought about a moment in a dead forest, when he looked at a dying enemy and chosen compassion. That single moment had changed everything, had broken his life apart and rebuilt it into something new and strange and terrifying. But also, he was beginning to realize, something with potential, something worth fighting for. He reached out and took Serafina's hand, gripping it firmly. "I'm in," he said. "Although, for the record, I think we're both absolutely insane." "Good," Serafina replied, pulling him to his feet. "Sanity is overrated. Insanity is far more interesting." And standing there in a sanctuary outside of time, holding hands with a vampire princess who'd nearly killed him an hour ago, Elias found himself laughing. Genuine, full-throated laughter that echoed off the luminescent walls and scattered into the impossible sky above. Tomorrow would bring complications, questions, difficult choices and dangerous paths. But tonight, for this moment, he allowed himself to simply be present with the absurdity and wonder of it all. He'd given his blood to save an enemy, and somehow, impossibly, it had saved him too. The safe house was a modest structure by vampire standards. Only 3 rooms, minimal decoration, no grand architectural statements. But it was secure, hidden deep in the mountains that marked the border between human and nocturnal territories, protected by enchantments that made it invisible to casual observation. Elias stood at the window, watching snow fall over the peaks, and marveled at how much his life had changed in such a short time. The bond had fully manifested now. He could feel Serafina even when she wasn't present, Currently, she was in the main room, poring over maps and intelligence reports she'd gathered from her network of contacts. The connection was like a warm thread running through his chest, tethering him to her presence. When she was pleased, he felt it as a gentle glow. When she was frustrated, it manifested as a subtle tension in his shoulders. It had been deeply unsettling at first, this constant awareness of someone else's emotional state. But he was adapting, learning to distinguish her feelings from his own, to appreciate the connection without letting it overwhelm his sense of self. And the benefits? Those were harder to deny. He was stronger now. Not vampire strong, but noticeably enhanced compared to his human baseline. He could run for hours without tiring, lift weights that would have strained him before, recover from injuries in days instead of weeks. His senses had sharpened too. He could hear conversations from rooms away, track scents through the air, see clearly in darkness that would have blinded him before. Most unsettling of all, he'd stopped aging. Or rather, his aging had slowed to a crawl. The small scar on his chin from a training accident years ago had faded almost entirely. The laugh lines around his eyes had smoothed out. He looked, if anything, slightly younger than he had before the bond. Serafina had explained that this was normal, that his body was adapting to match hers, that eventually he'd settle into a state of extremely slow aging that would keep him vital for centuries. Centuries. He still couldn't quite wrap his mind around that. Elias. Seraphine's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, a letter in her hand, and an expression on her face he'd learned to recognize as carefully controlled anger. We have a problem. What kind of problem? The kind that involves both our peoples trying to kill us. She entered the room and handed him the letter. This arrived by Raven an hour ago. It's from my mother. The Eternal Night Court has declared me rogue for abandoning my post and consorting with the enemy. I'm to return immediately for trial or be hunted as a traitor. Elias felt his stomach sink. And I also received this. She produced a second letter, this one bearing the seal of the Human Military Command. Your people have declared you a deserter and possible collaborator. There's a bounty on your head, alive if possible, dead if necessary. She tossed both letters onto a nearby table with disgust. So, it begins. The inevitable response when someone dares to step outside the expected roles. We're enemies, you and I. We're supposed to kill each other, not work together. The very existence of our bond threatens the narrative both sides have built their power on. Elias picked up the letters, scanning them quickly. The language was different, but the message was the same. Return, submit, or be destroyed. They're afraid, he said, setting the letters down, of what we represent, of the possibility that maybe this war isn't as necessary as they've been telling everyone.
Fear leads to violence, Serafina agreed. They'll send hunters, human strike teams, vampire assassins. They won't stop until we're dead or captured. She moved to the window, standing beside him, their shoulders touching. The contact sent a pulse of warmth through the bond. Comfort, solidarity, determination. I won't go back, she said quietly. I won't break our bond or pretend it doesn't exist just to make them comfortable. I meant what I said in the sanctuary. I want to build something better. With you. Elias looked at her, really looked at her. In the 2 months since their bonding, he'd come to know her as more than just a vampire princess. She was brilliant, driven, occasionally ruthless when necessary, but never cruel. She had a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard at unexpected moments. She was terrible at cooking, not that vampires needed to cook, but excellent at strategy. She could be imperious and demanding one moment, then surprisingly vulnerable the next. She was, he'd realized with some consternation, quickly becoming the most important person in his life. "I won't go back either," he said. "I stopped being a soldier for their war the moment I saved you. Now I'm a soldier for ours." Serafina smiled, though there was sadness in it. "Then we run," she said. "We stay ahead of the hunters. We continue building our network, gathering evidence, making contacts with those on both sides who might be sympathetic to our cause. And when we're strong enough, when we have enough proof and support, we make our move," Elias finished. "We present our case. We force them to see that cooperation is possible." "Exactly." She turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "It's going to be dangerous, Elias, more dangerous than anything you've ever faced before. We'll be fugitives, hunted by everyone. There will be times when you'll wish you'd never knelt beside me in that forest." "Maybe," Elias conceded, "but I'd still make the same choice, because the alternative, going back to the endless killing, the pointless war, the cycle of hatred, that's worse than any danger we might face." He squeezed her hands, feeling the bond pulse between them, stronger now than it had been in the beginning, reinforced by shared experiences and growing trust. "We're in this together," he said, "whatever comes. Partners, equals, consorts." The last word still felt strange, but less so than before. It was growing familiar, like a new name that was slowly becoming his own. Serafina's expression softened, and, for a moment, she looked not like a princess or a vampire or a warrior, but simply like a young woman who'd found something unexpected and precious in the darkness. "Together," she agreed. Then she pulled him into an embrace, resting her head against his shoulder. Through the bond, Elias felt a complex swirl of emotions: gratitude, determination, affection, and underneath it all, a fierce protective instinct that mirrored his own feelings exactly. They stood like that for a long moment, two beings from opposite sides of an ancient war, holding on to each other while the world outside prepared to tear them apart. But they'd faced impossible odds before. They'd survived against all logic and reason. They would survive this too, because they had something their enemies didn't: a bond forged in compassion, strengthened by trust, and powered by the simple, radical belief there had to be a better way.